the pace of change today is almost hard to keep track of, but that's what we're going to keep trying to keep doing, and we're
You
happy
need to
for you
re-record that, Alex. The pace of change today is almost impossible to keep track of. What the fuck is that? The opening to a Thomas Friedman column? Come on.
Okay, fine. Hello, dear patrons. Welcome back to BungaCast. It's the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli, and I'm here with Phil Cunliffe and George Hoare. Hello, boys. Hello, Bunga boys, fellow Bunga boys.
Hey.
It's Friday, the 14th of October, and we're here to talk about the scintillating subject of Trussonomics. In fact, we're sitting down to record this kind of midway through the day, and we've all been checking Twitter to see the latest. And the latest is
it looks like Trussonomics is over.
Trussonomics.
So we need a new topic.
Timely as always. No, the truth of the matter is that Liz Truss, who is possibly the most hilarious prime minister Britain has had, it has her chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, has now been sacked for the budget that he did. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a second. He's been sacked, and the former health secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has been brought in. And he's been brought in because the markets have reacted extremely negatively to a mini budget that was released a couple of days ago. So anyway, we're going to talk about this. And the reason for it is that in the midst of neoliberalism's slow collapse that we've been talking about for 5 years on this podcast, this, and specifically Liz Truss's premiership, has been a pretty blatant attempt to revive it, to kind of play the old hits back once again as if it's 1993. And there has been a negative market reaction to that. So I think that demands a lot of explanation. Why have the markets disliked what would be seen as fairly typical neoliberal recipes? Anyway, so to get this started, Phil, why don't you talk us through kind of what's exactly happened for those who haven't followed what the ongoings of a small, dreary, rainy island in the North Atlantic, about which we know little.
Indeed. Thank you, Alex, for your typically self-deprecating English introduction to British politics. It's always appreciated. Our listeners appreciate it, and I appreciate it too. So the latest is, Truss has announced not only, as the Chancellor Kwarteng resigned and was humiliatingly called back from meetings with top financiers in Washington, I think meetings with the IMF, in fact, humiliating enough that Britain was effectively being taken to DC. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was sent to DC in order to be kind of given a talking to by the IMF, humiliating enough, and then cut short the discussions with the IMF to be sent back to Britain in order to be fired by a long-standing kind of apparently personal friend and political ally, Liz Truss, the Prime Minister. In addition to that, she's given a short, the latest news is, which is around 3:00 in the afternoon here in the UK. She's given a very short press conference where she's announced that the tax cuts, the corporation tax cuts that were planned to come in and that were one of the centerpiece of this so-called mini budget they introduced shortly. When was it? The mini budget was like not even 2 weeks ago?
23rd of September.
So 3 weeks, all right. So just not even a month. And as part of, anyway, she's reversed the tax cuts. So the tax cuts, it was, they were meant to, the tax cuts for corporations was meant to drop to 19% from 25%. And now they're going to go back up to 25%. So it seems like, and the pound apparently is rising, and the market is breathing a sigh of relief at the prospect of higher taxes on corporations to boot. Not to put too fine a point on it. So it's a kind of, in addition to the kind of the gyrations in UK policy, the apparent weakness of the Prime Minister, and all of this is kind of with rumours flying that she's going to be ousted in a palace coup by Christmas. And, this is only after they just got rid of Boris Johnson earlier this year. So, this is kind of Latin American, maybe even Brazilian levels of political instability now in our, in otherwise, what is in the mother of all parliaments, and a centerpiece of political stability in the world. In addition to all of that, there's the bigger kind of thematic question, which is of interest to us, which is how far, what the attempt, as Alex suggested, the failed attempt to bring back neoliberalism, what that tells us about neoliberalism in global politics. And so it's worth, I guess, having a bit of kind of background to the Trussonomics project. So, yeah. I mean, apart from it's essentially tax cutting was the mini budget, was tax cutting, reducing taxes on corporations, reducing taxes on the wealthy, reducing taxes at the bottom end, not as much as they reduce taxes at the top end. And then they also promised so-called, they were talking about new kind of so-called supply side measures to stimulate growth. All of this was packaged as indicating the need for boosting British productivity and boosting economic growth. And so, as Adam Tooze pointed out elsewhere, in one of the writings that you can see on the show notes, there is kind of an indication has imprinted itself now in Britain's political class. There is an acknowledgement that the central question for British political economy is restoring economic growth and productivity. But all of this, there was never any kind of, beyond tax cuts, there was never really anything concrete offered up as to what those other stimulants to growth would be. So it was very much kind of presented as essentially tax cuts, but also the background to Truss and to Kwarteng, her chancellor that she's just fired, is that they both kind of are very much from the neoliberal think tank world. I mean, that's the kind of place that they were politically incubated, and they were both co-authors of a pamphlet called Britannia Unchained some years back, while they were still both on the backbenches and when they were far away from power. And this was a classic kind of neoliberal think tank pamphlet, where the whole idea was, if you kind of cut away the red tape, and if you try and emulate places like Singapore, the market will kind of spontaneously assert itself and drive a new era of British prosperity and growth.
So yeah, this is this Singapore on Thames idea, right, that they were trying to push as one vision of a post-Brexit Britain. But George, I think before we go forward, maybe it's worth going back a little bit and just setting up the context of austerity Britain, which preceded it from, over the past decade, effectively.
Yeah, so just to take first things first. So Singapore on Thames, the Thames is Father Thames is a river that runs through London and parts of the south of Britain, including Reading and Caversham.
Less geography, more political economy.
But it's and Singapore. Oh, okay, we don't need to talk about Singapore. But the yeah, so I guess it might or might not be useful to just give a bit of a brief history of the last sort of 10 years or 15 years of conservatism in Britain, because I think one thing which Truss it was only 2 weeks into being Prime Minister that she made this mini budget announcement and basically seems now to have sunk her premiership, if not her party. So it's really quickly after the departure of Johnson that the contradictions in the limitations of contemporary conservatism in Britain were revealed. But yeah, as you said, Alex, what's the kind of the mid-range history? So yeah, 2010 we had a coalition government. David Cameron as Prime Minister and George Osborne as Chancellor were particularly keen in the aftermath of the global financial crisis to impose austerity, which basically meant cutting state spending and, if not handouts, to political allies and contractors associated with the Conservative Party. I think those maintained strong levels throughout the last 15 years. And this kind of ideological, more than anything else, commitment to low state spending dominated British conservatism over the course of the 2010s until, of course, the Brexit referendum in 2016. And then I guess, to cut a very long story and one that we've talked about quite a lot in this podcast before, short, this was essentially resolved in 2019 by Boris Johnson, successful attempt to create a coalition of traditional Tories with working class northern Brexit supporters. And this was the kind of, there was some one nation conservatism packaging at some point, but that was basically the class basis of the coalition. And you could say that this, it was tested during COVID, and that was what eventually led to Johnson's breakdown and or destruction by the party. And so you had Truss coming in, basically thinking, okay, we don't want this coalition anymore. We don't want this. We want to appeal to our kind of older base of people who don't want to pay the top band of tax, people who want to pay or want to make more money by corporations paying less tax. Let's see what we can do here. And this very quickly ran into some of the problems that I think we're going to be discussing over the course of the rest of this episode.
Yeah, I mean, what's amazing about this episode, I thought, looking at it in kind of global comparison, is that there's been several instances in various countries of parties trying to apply a old school neoliberal recipe when it seems that the winds are blowing in a different direction. But what's kind of unique about the British case is that the ruling party stumbled on a recipe for some post-neoliberal management of the economy with a greater role for state spending, and then deliberately self-sabotage, seemingly, I mean, from the outside, for no reason whatsoever, having basically been given this recipe on a plate or stumbled upon it, only to then reverse it to obviously disastrous consequences. We'll come on to the political consequences a little bit more explicitly in a bit, but I mean, just to foreshadow that, the Labour Party is set for, according to recent polls, for, an absolutely thumping majority, to the extent that the Tories might not even be the second largest party in Parliament. Hey there, you've reached the end of a short excerpt from an episode that's been released only to our patrons. If you'd like to join us and gain access to around 2 Patreon exclusive episodes a month, please go to patreon.com/bungacast. We'd love to have you.